Well, hello and welcome to 15-Minute Theology, a podcast covering the central truths of the Christian faith in normally just about 15 minutes. But on today's episode, we're going to actually shoot a little bit longer than that. The first way more than 15 minutes with a theologian happened a few months ago. And now at the end of season 2, we are doing yet another bonus episode to cover some more ground with another theologian. And joining me for this special bonus episode is somebody who's familiar to 15-Minute Theology, Matt Emerson. Matt, thanks for coming on back.
Hey, Tyler, glad to be back. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely, man. People were really helped by your episode on the Trinity. Just usually 15 minutes for eternal generation doesn't happen,
Right.
But you were able to make it happen, which is pretty great.
It happens eternally. So
yeah, there you go. Nice. Yeah. You were ready for that one. I was right there.
I was.
So in this conversation, we're just going to talk through a little bit of theology proper and the place that theology proper plays in the Christian life. Reason being, just finished up 2 seasons of dealing with theology proper. These things feel very high, lofty, distant. The goal of this show is to take these things and make them more practical on the ground, but also show how these things play out in just regular elements of spiritual formation. And so that's what we're going to be talking through. Matt, you're the perfect guy to do this. So to jump in, can you just give us a little bit of understanding who you are? We didn't really get a bio of who you are in the first one. So can you give us just first who you are, where you're at, and then how did you get interested in studying theology and then theology proper specifically?
Yeah. So I am from Huntsville, Alabama originally. I went to Auburn for college, War Eagle. My wife and I started dating in high school, went to college together, and then got married after we both graduated. And then I felt called to ministry late in high school and knew I was going to go to seminary after college. So after I graduated, my wife and I went to Southeastern for my MDiv. And throughout that time period, I assumed that I was called to some kind of ministry within a local church. I think I was thinking senior pastor at some point, but was open to other kinds of ways to serve the church. And my wife was pregnant with our first kid, and I was graduating, and I didn't have a full-time job. I was like, what am I going to do? So, as with many people, I said, if I can't get a job, maybe I'll just do more school. And so I stayed and did a PhD in biblical theology. At the time, Dr. Aiken kept saying, boys, we need more PhDs in the pulpit. And so I decided
that was a good impression. That was a good impression.
I decided that, hey, I got nothing else going on. Why not do a PhD? So, and I like to read. I was a nerd, whatever. So I stayed, did a PhD. At the time, I thought at the end of that, I was still going to serve the church in some capacity in the local church, and was thinking about going back to Alabama to help train church planners. I'd never planted a church. I didn't know how to plant a church, but I was going to go train church planners, I guess.
Come on.
And the Lord, I was sitting at my desk and I was reading a book on church planning, but I had also already finished my dissertation. So theoretically, I never had to read another book or write another sentence in my life if I wanted to at that point. Right, I finished my dissertation, waiting for it to come back for my defense. And I was sitting there at my desk reading this book, but under my desk, I had checked out 50 books from the library on Galatians 4 to read because I wanted to write a blog post about it. And I kind of, God used that moment where I was like, I don't really want to read this church planning book. I want to read about Galatians 4 and write this paper.
Wow.
God used that moment to clarify that he was calling me into academic ministry. Still wanted to serve the church, still wanted to serve in local churches, but in terms of vocation, clarified that I was called to academic ministry. And so I said, okay, God, well, there are no jobs, so how about that? And
what do we do now? Yeah.
So he took me to California, which was not on the radar. Boy from Alabama, never been out of the deep South, and he called me to California Baptist, and taught there for 4 years. And then, we California is an adjustment, but we grew to love our church and our friends, and I love Cal Baptist. But my wife and I also knew that eventually we wanted to get a little bit closer to Alabama, just for the sake of longevity of our family and parents, both sets of our parents are from Alabama, and they still are in Alabama. So wanted to get closer. This job came open at OBU, or a job came open. I applied initially to be a professor here. So I came to teach basically biblical theology, and have been at OBU since 2015. Oklahoma Baptist University, not the other OBU, which if anybody went there, I'm talking about Ouachita. But we call that the other OBU. I'm pretty sure they call us the other OBU as well. So anyway, Oklahoma Baptist University is where I am.
They're the other ones. They're the other ones.
For this podcast, they are. That's right.
There you go. There you go.
And so came to OBU 2015. And since then, I have taken on a number of different administrative roles. And now I'm serving as Dean of Theology, Arts, and Humanities, and also as the co-provost. And, I love OBU. Our tagline is all of life, all for Jesus, which I think is fantastic.
Come on. That's amazing.
And, we want to equip the next generation of future shapers to live all of life, all for Jesus. That's our motto.
That's pretty fantastic, man.
Yeah. And so, that's what we're about. We think Jesus is Lord over all of creation. That means he's Lord over every discipline at a university, and that faith matters for those disciplines, just like it matters for the study of the Bible. And that's what I'm doing now. We've got 5 daughters. Alicia and I have 5 daughters. They're 14, 12, 10, and twin 8-year-olds.
Okay.
By the time this airs, the 12-year-old will be a 13-year-old. So I'll have 2 teenagers in my house. Okay, so that's me. And then in terms of how did I get into the study of the doctrine of God, I'm going to try to make this a little bit shorter. So when I was at Cal Baptist, I was there for a year. So I taught in the online and night area at Cal Baptist. So I taught online night classes. And I was what they called a faculty lead for that area. And so I was the only person in that area for the first year in Christian studies. And then year 2 hired 3 other faculty, Matthew Barrett, John Gill, who is not the 17th century John Gill, but another John Gill who teaches Baptist history. And then Luke Stamps. And Luke and I developed a close friendship. And there's a lot to that story in terms of our interests and common study. But one of the things that we realized in talking to each other was we were interested in recovering the Christian tradition for Baptist churches, because Baptists are not really known today to be very well connected to the Christian tradition for a variety of reasons. And I mean, that includes liturgical retrieval in terms of worship practices, but it also included doctrinal retrieval. And so Luke and I started reading some books together. We read Kevin Giles' book on the eternal generation of the Son. I ended up writing an ETS paper on it, on hermeneutics in the early church. And that kind of started the ball rolling on my interest in the doctrine of God. It's really from the angle of how do we understand and even recover the kind of biblical interpretation that led to the formulation of this doctrine. And why today do we have a different kind of biblical interpretation that leads people to reject these kinds of doctrines, like eternal generation or like simplicity? And so I'm a biblical theologian by training, not a systematician. So my interest in systematics is along that kind of hermeneutical retrieval angle. How do we retrieve the hermeneutics of the early church that led to the formulation of Nicaea for today? So yeah, that's what I would say about that.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. I think when a lot of people think through the doctrine of God, they really are coming at it from the angle of systematics. We're finding bits and pieces and pulling them apart and not seeing them as a connected whole. And what I've loved about your approach, and also about everything you guys are doing at Center for Baptist Renewal, you're taking both worlds and putting them together, right? Like there's beauty in the systematics, there's beauty in the biblical theology. Let's pull it all together. I remember, actually, this is where I first heard of you. One of the episodes y'all did on Irenaeus in his book is on the apostolic preaching, right? Yeah, that's essentially the church's first biblical theology. And he's sort of using the rule of faith of how do we understand this whole thing in light of itself and see the doctrine that forms out of it.
Yeah.
Very helpful, very formative, and I think is something that is not the norm, not only just in Baptist life, but I think in a majority of American evangelical life, of how do we understand the scriptures in order to arrive at understanding of who God is.
Right.
So then in light of that, I think that when we start to study the doctrine of God, sometimes there can feel a little bit of a hiccup with folks, as I've just been talking with people creating these. One of the hiccups people find is, well, what do I do with the doctrine of God in relation to all other doctrines? Does this now become the one above everything else? Like, does the doctrine of God inform every other doctrine? Is it derived from other doctrines? This is kind of getting to your idea of hermeneutics as well. So how would you say understanding and seeing the doctrine of God rightly plays itself out in our doing of theology?
Yeah, that's a really big question that I'm going to try to give a short answer to.
Sorry, man. Sorry to do
No,
it
that's
too.
okay. I mean, and we can follow up on any aspect of it that you want. But I mean, I think that it's important to understand that for the early church, who God is was not secondary or tangential or, outside of the question of what do we believe about everything else. So, and in fact, it wasn't even outside of or next to or something that didn't matter in terms of how they read the Bible. Actually, who God is and how they described that was the God who they worship in their local congregations is the triune God who has revealed himself in God the Son incarnate, Jesus Christ our Lord, who died for our sins and rose from the grave. I mean, that just is who God is. And they didn't pretend to forget about that as they read the Bible.
That's good.
And they didn't pretend to forget about really that as they did theology. So yes, who God is informs everything else we say and do, both about hermeneutics and about systematic theology. And I mean, I'll just say this as well, because I was thinking it in the previous question. Early Christian theologians didn't separate the disciplines like we do. It wasn't like they were going to do systematic over here and biblical theology over here. It was just Christian theology. It was Lectio Divina, reading the Bible to know God. And that was it. And so sometimes they're like, I'm going to do a deep dive on this passage and talk about the Greek and Hebrew. And other times it's like, we can't believe this about God because it would make this thing about God that's also true false. And so they're doing some kind of systematic or philosophical theology. And often those two things are, and more than that, are all together lumped into one discourse. So the separation of the disciplines is part of the problem, and even one of the motivations for that kind of question. It's a good question, but it only can be asked in an environment in which we have separated those things out when they shouldn't be.
Yes. And I think they are separated out maybe first in an academic space, but it works its way into the pew, where we can start to think, oh, this happens over here, this happens over here, and it is a full picture together of who God is and what the rule of faith is as a whole. Yeah. So I agree with you entirely.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little tricky on how this ball started rolling. I mean, it is sort of true that, it definitely is true today that it starts in the academy and then trickles its way into the churches. But, in the late Middle Ages, it's harder to separate those things out. I do think the university as a kind of idea has driven some of this, maybe a lot of it. But it actually started as a churchly and academic enterprise to try to separate out questions and answer them in a logical fashion. So it's not as neat at the source of the problem as it is today when we encounter the problem.
Yeah. I'm noticing, though, that there is a renewed interest in these conversations. Folks like yourself, Matthew Barrett, the Credo guys, they're doing amazing work. I've had like 3 Credo guys on this project. They're tremendous. I've had like 3 of y'all at Center for Baptist Renewal and 3 Credo guys. It's been friggin' amazing.
There's something in the water.
There's something going on. There is some kind of renewal happening and a focus on it. What do you think is leading to that?
Well, I think, academically, many of us are following in the footsteps of a movement called ressourcement from the Roman Catholic Academy, where essentially there was a reaction to, this is so debated that I don't even want to summarize it, because I don't want like some kind of random Roman Catholic Twitter apologist coming at me. But my understanding is that ressourcement was a reaction to what was perceived as a kind of rigid Thomism in the church's life, and that you had a number of scholars, including Yves Conger and Henri de Lubac and a number of others, who said we need to recover, Jean Danielou, we need to recover the actual interpretation of Scripture. Right? We don't just need to repeat kind of scholastic categories and conclusions. I'm not going to say anything. I'll leave that comment that I just had pop through my head.
Yeah, just let it go.
Filters
Magic
on.
of editing too. Yeah. Just keep on rolling.
So, there's that academic conversation that was happening kind of in the early to mid 1900s, and that's been picked up. And I don't know how conscious or unconscious it is, but it has been picked up by Protestant academic theologians and biblical scholars. I think, though, maybe more importantly, and maybe this even includes the initial Roman Catholic ressourcement movement, I don't know, but I think more importantly, we're in a social moment where we are in some ways we are at the end of modernity, and modernity has cut off the branch on which we are standing. We are totally disconnected from the past in every way, and I think people are even subconsciously realizing there's nothing left to stand on. And there's really two choices, right? There's more than that, but there's two choices people can make. Number one is they're going to stand on their own individuality, which is where you see a number of the social trends today going. But then you can also find something more concrete and foundational to stand on. And I think there are errors actually on both sides. There's important things to say that are good about both sides of that choice. But it's not like individuality is bad, something concrete is good, right? Both of those things bring blessings and curses. But in any case, I think the retrieval movements that you see, some of which you've mentioned, there are others. There's ressourcement, et cetera. In the previous generation, Robert Weber, Evangelicals on the Canterbury Trail. This has been going on for a while, and I think it is, in a positive sense, that attempt to reconnect to the past that we've tried to jettison, and we're now realizing we can't actually disconnect ourselves from the saints who have gone before us. There are other motivations for ressourcement, some of which are good, some of which are not good. But those are the big ones, I think.
Yeah. On a whole, if that's the aim for retrieval, that's a very good aim. We do really, I find that the church I grew up in, maybe the church you grew up in, there was trying to distance yourself from the past. There was we're going to do a new, fresh, different thing, kind of that emphasis in that movement. And I found it to be very sweet to be sitting in a moment where we're actually going to pull from brothers and sisters from 2,000 years and let them inform us. I'm just thinking of Ephesians 4. It's one Lord, one faith, one baptism. That's the same faith, the essence of the same thing for 2,000 years. It's a sweet thing. It's a buttressing thing as well. Like, we don't just believe something in this moment and in this time period that goes as quickly as the ideas of the present day. This actually has roots. It has very deep roots. Yeah, it's a beautiful thing, really.
It is. I think that it is a beautiful thing. I think we always need to be cautious about any movement. I think we need to be cautious about the retrieval movement. I mean, I'm sitting here in it, trying to lead some of it in my own small way, but there are dangers. There's a danger of repristinating the past and not recognizing the errors or missteps taken by those that we're trying to retrieve. There is an error of, and I think evangelicals, even in attempting to do retrieval, many of us still fall into the second trap, which is we only want to know the past in order to own our enemies in the present. And I think that's a big danger for retrieval movements. And this is true. I mean, like the same thing is true in the Roman Catholic Ressourcement movement. Like that, in some sense, there was some motivation there to try to retrieve the past in order to, I don't know, intellectually put down the people that they thought were doing it wrong. And I think that's a constant danger in retrieval, is to weaponize it.
Yeah.
So we have to be careful of that. And I think, a third danger would be going about retrieval in such a way that, I mean, these two go hand in hand. Going about retrieval in such a way that we are dismissive of the past because it's past. And I know that sounds weird in retrieval work, right? But both weaponizing it and then being dismissive kind of go hand in hand, right? You weaponize what helps you and you dismiss what doesn't.
Right. Yeah.
I think those are big dangers, right? And repristination is related to that as well. You are trying to identify someone or some thought process or work that is unassailable, and that just doesn't exist. And all of that is related to actually trying to understand the context of these writers and also their own lines of argument. I think a lot of times it's like, man, you read, what's an example? Here's one. So I was talking about this in another context recently, where I think it was Gregory of Nazianzus. I can't remember. It was one of the Gregories, I think, was talking about Micah and some of the other minor prophets, and they were using this language about the names of the constellations to talk about the fact that God is simple. And you read that and you go, what is happening here? But when you actually it is, dope. But when you read the actual context of the argument, it makes perfect sense. If you give the author enough room, so to speak, in your own mind to do the work that he's attempting to do, and not the work that you expect of him.
Right.
We expect when we ask, well, can you prove to me that simplicity is taught in the Bible? We expect a kind of, for lack of a better term, proof texting. And proof texting is important. You want to show that stuff is actually in the Bible that you're teaching, right? But, there's not a verse that says God is simple and not made of parts.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that simplicity isn't biblical.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what got me started on this question in 2013, is you read stuff about eternal generation and people are dismissive of it because there's not a verse that says the Father eternally communicates the divine essence to the Son. Right? But that's not what it means to be biblical. And in fact, the pressure for a proof text, so to speak, is the hermeneutic of Arius and the subordinationists, not the hermeneutic of the Nicenes.
That's really good.
So retrieval has to take into account all of that. We're not trying to repristinate, we're not trying to weaponize, and we're not trying to be dismissive. We're attempting to allow other saints who have lived before us to come alongside us and help us with the problems that the church faces today, both theological, moral, and liturgical. Mm-hmm. That's what we're trying to do.
I love that. It reminds me of the I've been really drinking from the Neo-Calvinist movement in the last few years, and I've really appreciated the method of orthodox yet modern. It's the same thing. It's the Orthodox faith said for 2,000 years, yet it must happen in a modern space. And so that
Mhm.
makes it where we have to see the teachings honestly, and we have to see the
Right.
people honestly, and humbly receive it in order to humbly communicate it in a way that's going to be understood presently.
Right.
In the same vein, I'm curious on a few elements of the doctrine of God. I think
we got to talk
I
about
think
that.
hey, listen, I love it. I'll talk about all of this, man. This is fun. The piece of theological retrieval with the doctrine of God, it's presently what's going on. And I think an element that's happening in that in our day is people are now starting to think through, oh, this actually has elements of forming the Christian life. This is not a detached thing. This is actually something that's going to shape who I am. So I'm just going to give you some pieces of the doctrine of God. He's simple. He's not in parts, but you know what I'm saying. And you just tell me, okay, this is a way that this doctrine leads to spiritual formation. Does that sound good?
Yeah. My answers are going to be repetitive probably, but let's do it.
That actually might prove the point, which is going to be pretty great.
Yep.
Let's go with Trinity. So God is a Trinity. How does that inform the Christian life?
In every way possible, but in particular, and this is where it's probably going to get repetitive. This is who God is in himself, and therefore it's who we worship. And so to understand the doctrine of the Trinity is to grow in your understanding of the God that you love and serve and who saved you. And to be dismissive or like treat the doctrine of the Trinity as a checkbox that I can move on from after I've joined the church and never think about it again, that's actually the opposite of what it ought to be for the Christian life. It ought to be something you reflect on every day because it's reflection on, again, the God who you worship, who you serve, and who saved you. I think additionally, it informs our prayer life and our spiritual practices, how we pray, the shape of our prayer, the shape of how we grow in holiness from the Father through the Son by the Spirit. I talk to my students all the time about how we look to Jesus, not because Jesus is the most important person of the Trinity, but because Jesus is the image of the Father. And in seeing Jesus, we see the Father. And that also in seeing Jesus, we're changed by the Spirit into the image of Jesus. So that's, John 14 through 16 plus 2 Corinthians 17 and 18. There's a Trinitarian shape to the Christian life that both informs how we pray about things and also is our experience of the Christian life. This is how we experience God.
Boom. Come on. Let's come back to the spiritual practices in a second. I'm curious on that.
Okay.
All right. So that's Trinity. What about simplicity?
Everything. Worship.
Copy paste?
Yeah.
Or is there something? What would you say is kind of like the narrow thing for simplicity? That like if God weren't simple, this would be a problem. But because he is simple, this is now something that can shape us. Yeah.
So this is going to sound roughly similar to if you asked me about immutability, which is, but I mean, those two things go together, right? Simplicity is kind of it's still not a positive way to say it, but it's less negative than immutability. Immutability is a negation of who God is.
Not
right?
able to change.
He's not able to change. Yeah. Simplicity, we're stating something positively. God is who he is entirely. Now that comes with a negation, right? He's therefore not made of parts.
Not other things. Yeah.
Yes, he's right. Not. But simplicity means that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Because God is not made of parts, there is no point in time in which he, kind of like Transformers or Voltron or, Power Rangers, becomes the true and greater thing to fight. What's her name? Rita Repulsa.
No idea. You lost me there. I was there up until that.
Go Power Rangers. He doesn't become something bigger and badder and better at some point in time, nor even though there's not a point in time where that happens, if he was made of parts, it's possible in theory for that to have happened, and it's also possible in theory for him to lose a part of himself. You know, that's kind of abstract, but it's important because it means that God literally cannot change.
Yeah.
He is not, and so this is why simplicity and immutability go together. He cannot change. He's not going to change. He's the same yesterday and today and forever. And when you tell people who are grieving and suffering and hurting and they're confused and they don't know what to do, and you say, look, right now God is like this. I mean, it's possible he might change, but right now he's like this. That's not comforting to anyone.
Yeah.
Right. What's comforting is for you to be able to say, this is who the God of the Bible is, and he's always been that same God, and he always will be that same God, and he is right now that God to you in this moment. So it's really, and this, if you go read the 4th century writers, this is an incredibly pastoral doctrine. They did not conceive of simplicity as an abstraction that is unrelated to pastoral ministry. They wrote about it because they felt like it was important for their people to hear pastorally that God can't change. The other thing I would say about simplicity is that, and this is maybe in distinction from immutability now, although it's still related. The other thing about simplicity is that it means that God's attributes are not in conflict with each other.
So good.
We a lot of times we talk about, you know, God's love wins over God's wrath or something like that, or, you know, how can God be both good and wrathful against sin at the same time? How can he be loving? How can he be just? And, you know, blah 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 blah. Well, he's not made of parts. He just is who he is. So God just is love and justice and holiness and goodness and wrathfulness against sin, etc. He just is those things. Period. And there's, I mean, we had a different episode we talk about wrath in that list, but
we've got one coming out in a few weeks. So
great.
Or would have just come out. Yeah.
He just is those things.
Yeah.
And they are him. So they're not distinct things from him. They're not things he possesses. He just is those attributes. And that means that he doesn't have conflict within himself, and he doesn't have conflict in relation to you or to me.
There, man. Yeah.
He does not sometimes hate you and sometimes love you. And that's an incredibly pastoral statement, right? He is wrathful against sin, and yet he is determined to love you through Jesus Christ, who bore the wrath on the tree. And so there's no conflict in him between love and hate, depending on your own actions. Now, I mean, there's a lot to talk about in terms of what happens when someone's saved. God doesn't change, but your status before God changes. This sort of thing. So there's a lot to talk about with that. But I mean, I think that's the main thing. God isn't at conflict with himself, and he's not at conflict when he thinks about you.
Yeah, it is incredibly pastoral. It's very comforting to the heart. The piece you just talked about, I remember Bavinck talks about immutability. Like, it's not as if God's changed, but I'm seeing a different side of his face, right? Like his face is simply turning to me differently in repentance and unrepentance, right? So actually him seeing a different side of his face as a sinner who's repentant or unrepentant is actually a sign of his immutability, and that he's going to be the same way to the repentant and the same way to the unrepentant as he always would or has been. So good, man. You mentioned spiritual practices earlier. If this can be brief, I don't know if it can, but we'll try. How does the doctrine of God shape our corporate formation as well as our personal formation?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the same shape for both. What we are doing in worship is seeing the Son through word and sacrament and by the power of the Spirit. And in seeing the Son, we are seeing the Father and also being changed in the image of the Son by the Spirit to the glory of the Father. So, you know, our worship practices ought to have that aim in mind. And so you could walk through everything: praying, singing, preaching, eating, reading. All those practices ought to have that intent or aim to them. And, I do think there's wisdom in ancient worship models, but even in more contemporary models where you're not, participating in the same historic liturgy, that's fine, but your aim ought to be the same.
Yeah.
Your aim ought to be to point people to the Son by the Spirit so that they can see and know the Father.
Yeah. Yeah. It's freeing when it's more like that. Because then there's a single aim in what's happening. But if I'm also going to church on a Sunday morning, I'm recognizing that there is something happening here that is more than just me showing up.
Yeah.
It is me being made more into the likeness of my King,
Right.
and brought into that beautiful thing you were just talking about, being formed into Jesus by His Spirit.
Yes.
It's pretty wonderful. It's pretty gorgeous. All right, last thought for you. I am convinced the more I study doctrine, and specifically the doctrine of God, that the thing that drives mission specifically is God. It's not anything in and of myself. It's God and His gospel.
Yeah.
Could you break down for us how that can happen? How is it that the doctrine of God drives us then to obedience to His Great Commission? And I know I'm asking another Southeastern grad that, but it works out. It works out.
Yeah. So I'm going to try to be brief, but God's purpose in creation is to fill all the earth with image bearers of Himself. And mission, well, I'll take a step back again. God makes image bearers in order to fill the earth with image bearers of Himself. And so the purpose of creation is to be filled with the glory of God through human beings worshiping Him and ruling over creation. Because of sin, that purpose for creation is distorted. Not that anything can thwart God's purposes, but sin enters the world and thwarts our own ability to carry out God's purposes for us.
So good, yeah.
And so in redemption, what God is doing is reversing the curse of Adam, restoring what was lost in the fall. That includes and ultimately is for the purpose of restoring that mission, that creational purpose for us to fill the earth with worshipers of Yahweh, image bearers of Yahweh who rule over His place. And so mission is God's fulfillment of His own purpose of creation post-fall, where His purpose for creation is to be filled with His image bearers. Well, and who worship Him and rule. Well, because of the fall, people are in rebellion against Him. So what does He do? He sends His Son to live the life that we can't, die the death that we deserve, descend into hell to proclaim victory, rise from the dead in victory over the powers, and then ascended to heaven to rule and reign at the right hand of the Father. And in ascending, He sends His Spirit to the church in order to be His new little Adams and Eves.
Yeah, come on.
He is the second Adam, but then He breathes life into His church by His Spirit, sending them out as little Adams and Eves into the world to be fruitful and multiply. In fact, the Word of God is fruitful and multiplies in Acts 6, Acts 12, Acts 19.
Yeah,
that's G.K. Beale. And
new creation, right?
New creation, yeah. And mission is God. Yeah, mission is God fulfilling His purpose for creation through the redemption bought for us in the person and work of Jesus Christ.
There's no separating it. It's not like I'm doing something rogue.
Right. I don't want people to go to hell, and that's a motivation for missions.
Yep.
But a more important motivation for missions is God's motivation for missions, which is for image bearers to fill the earth and worship Him and rule in His place. And those aren't disconnected. Those are not disconnected motivations, right? But the motivation for people to be right with God ought to be fueled by an even more fundamental motivation, which is to participate in the work that God has for us in His work of creation and redemption.
Yeah. Both good things, like you mentioned, not disconnected from one another. But one one is God-centered.
Yes.
And while I also don't want people to perish, right? I don't want my main motivation to be rescuing men, because then I could make it where I'm the hero in that, or I can make it where my aim is to let their happiness be the aim, right? Which of course, I don't want them to perish or experience that, but actually the end goal has to be the renown and glory of the King, right? And accomplishing of his purposes, which then fuels the other.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, Matt Emerson, thank you so much. I appreciate you not only doing the short version, but also the long version of this podcast. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Absolutely. Glad to be
we had
on.
a lot of different
Thanks for
stuff
having
in
me.
there, man.
Yeah, that
was great.
That was a free-ranging conversation. So
those are the best kind. Those are the best kind.
That's right.
Thanks for everything. Thanks for all you do. If you haven't heard of Matt and his work, please go check out the Center for Baptist Renewal. Everything they're doing. I'm coughing. Sorry, it's a terrible way to end. Thanks for joining this episode of 15 Minute Theology, and we will see you next time.